All right. So today we're going to learn about utility versus component libraries. Um, Really, these are complementary tools. What these are libraries that we can use for the heavy lifting of user interface design, and especially with CSS, that does a lot of the sort of boilerplate or grunt work stuff that would be the same every time. You know what I mean? Like setting a margin to 8 pixels is the same, right? No matter what project we're doing, or deciding that, I need all of like when I'm setting margins and paddings and borders, I need it to all be like units of 8 pixels or something like that. Um, so in part one, we're going to look at Tailwind, which is sort of informally called a utility library. And we'll see that this sort of superpowers CSS. And in part two, we'll look at Bootstrap, which is a full-on component library where you can get UI components. Um, with both, I'll walk through the details of each, but we're going to learn how to install it and use its core features. And both require a little bit of setup work, and then there's a learning curve for each. And just to get a quick sense of these two libraries, so Tailwind is designed to give, as they call it, a utility first CSS framework, and it has a bunch of classes, CSS classes that Tailwind has created that give us really common utility. And you can see here in this animation, if you look over here for Flexbox, we've got basically it's setting display flex, flex direction column. It's doing the CSS to center the items. We can see interesting things here like text size, a medium font weight, a text color. And so we see the strategy of all these really little CSS classes that Tailwind has created for us that do one specific thing. Because if I want to set some text to be sky blue with a color weight of 500, that's not unique to like a particular button or anything else. And so this is why it's called sort of a utility library. It's all these utility classes that we can compose together. Tailwind came out a couple years ago now. It's gotten incredibly popular. It is honestly pretty cool. And it sort of uses this compositional strategy, right? Where again, we're using a lot of little classes and each one does one specific thing. It's a little confusing to kind of learn the naming system, but once you do, it's a whole lot easier. Bootstrap, which we'll see in part two of the lecture, is a totally different beast. Bootstrap was created by Twitter. It's been around for decades now, which is kind of amazing to say. Um, it was built in the days before React. And so it is, let's see, this is installation, but let's go look at its components. So originally, Bootstrap was JavaScript and CSS um, combined together. So you would have to import or load the Bootstrap CSS file and the Bootstrap JavaScript file. And the JavaScript was doing all of this work of stuff like accordions. You can see here, there's an awful lot of HTML here, and we have to use like these Bootstrap classes and IDs. And you don't type this out yourself. You usually copy and paste it from, say, the Bootstrap website to get you started. They give you boilerplate. Um, if we go to some other interesting components, just to show you very quickly, here's a good one, a carousel. And again, in the days before React, just building a carousel was not a small task. And again, we have the HTML and the CSS for this. And what we'll do is there is a React library for Bootstrap by the Bootstrap team. So it's official, where it has all of these things as React components, such as say maybe a card with a button or the Bootstrap nav bar. is pretty amazing. As I shrink and grow, we'll see that, well, we don't really see it here, but the nav bar is responsive. If I shrink this up, if we go to our nav bar, there we can see it. There's a hamburger menu on the right. And if I make it bigger, it goes back and forth, right? So every single Bootstrap component is responsive. Um, And so in part two of the lecture, we'll see Bootstrap. And as you can see, there's all these React components that we'd be using, this Bootstrap component library, and we still can set classes and stuff on them, but it sort of bundles up the JavaScript there. And this is extremely powerful, but pretty heavyweight. So between Tailwind and Bootstrap, you have two really good options. And there's a ton of UI component libraries out there these days. A really popular one has become one called Shad CN, which also, again, has a library of React components. And you can see there's like graphs and all sorts of cool stuff that it has in it in its component system. Let's see here, a date picker, right, which is incredibly useful to have. Google has something called Material UI, which has a React component library implementing Google's sort of design system, which is called Material UI. Um, I didn't realize they added pricing to it. I don't know about that. But if we look again at Material UI components, and let's look at maybe just like a radio button group here. Um, so we can see that they offer a lot of useful features. As you can see, Google's like gone heavily into the mobile first design. But we are just going to introduce you to Bootstrap and Tailwind because they're both extremely popular and well used. So, in part one, I'm gonna build up a React project. We're gonna see how to install Tailwind. I think I'll probably do a little bit of warm up and we'll maybe build out a bit of a to-do app before we dive in, but we'll set up Tailwind. We'll see how to do some basic styling of text. We'll see how to use Flexbox, which is awesome. And that'll take us into layout, and we'll see how Tailwind can deals with margin and padding and stuff like that. We'll see media breakpoints, and we'll see pseudo classes. And if we have time, we'll see something called groups and also turning on dark mode in Tailwind. Then we'll take a break, and for Bootstrap again, we'll set it up. We'll look at just a couple of the biggest Bootstrap UI components, probably the navbar, and we'll spend some time talking about Bootstrap's grid because it has an incredibly powerful layout tool. And we'll build a sort of Pokemon style card with Bootstrap where we'll grab some data from the Poke API and render it in a Bootstrap card. Any questions before we dive in? Okay, cool. Let me go ahead and so I'm in a Tailwind directory here. I'm just going to quickly create um, a Vite project. And we're going to do the normal thing that we do of cleanup, getting rid of the default Vite stuff. And I'm going to add maybe just enough code for a simple to-do app. So over here in app CSS, we're going to get rid of all of this. In index CSS, we're going to get rid of all of this. And then in the main app component, we're going to get rid of the logos that we're not using. We're going to get rid of that stuff that we're not using. And I'm just going to put a placeholder fragment here. And we'll just call it, to do app. And let's go ahead and let's run this. And now we've got our to-do app up and running. And again, everything renders inside this root div, right? React mounts here in main.jsx. And in fact, I'll remove that strict mode stuff so we don't get double renders. So now let's build out our to-do app a bit. And I am gonna use this as an opportunity to demo a little bit of the sort of like thinking in React strategy and to help us like warm our brains up from the long weekend. And let's do just a little bit of design work here. So basically, what I want to be able to do is I want to be able to list a bunch of tasks. And I'm not going to worry too much about the details of what's in a task. I think a task is going to have, like name, maybe an ID, maybe completed, and that's my task, right? And in fact, we can kind of just put these over here. And, I also want to be able to add a new task. So I want like an input field, I want a text field, and I want some sort of button. And this is sort of my rough like map of my UI here. And looking at this, we can start to think about components. I've got the app component. It sure looks like I need some sort of list of tasks. So maybe like a task list component. And then an individual task itself can be a component. And I might keep it simple and just leave these in the top level in my app. And I think this is a good starting point. And I know that my task is going to take in, um, well, it's going to take in, I think, a JavaScript object. That looks like this. And then here, I probably want to do something like, um, I want probably some sort of containing div and maybe an H4. And we'll do, let's destructure this task object that doesn't exist yet. And we'll put the name there. Um, and let's just say completed, and we'll put the completed status there as well. And let's use the ID as a key. And I know I'm going to need a task list of some sort. And before I get too far in this, I think I'm going to keep it simple. I'm going to make a couple tasks. I'm just going to do that right here just to keep life simple. And this is really sort of a grocery list.
Steak.
Steak, love it. And all these are going to be not completed. I may not get to, in the interest of time, we may not get to flipping completed from true to false inside the task. It'd be nice, if I could see a checkbox or something, but we'll worry about that later. I am going to create a little bit of component state here. And now that I've done this, I'm also going to go over to my app and my console logs. And I'm just going to console log. I like doing that. And we'll console log the tasks. So I like my console logs to kind of help me when I debug. And so now, you know, I talked about building a task list. So here's a task, and I want to list out the tasks. I may not need one. Let's see how we do here. We may not need one. And I have to be a little careful with all my names because there's a lot of things named task. And let's see here. There's a parentheses there that we don't want. We don't want that. Let's see what our error is now here. Unexpected token. Um,
In your task.jsx file,
mhm.
right at the top of that import, is that colon supposed to be there? Literally line one, far
Oh,
left.
no, it's not. Thank you so much. That's a little bit annoying. That's from Emmett. Um, let's see. It looks like I've got one other error here. Um, no, actually, we're cooking, and it looks like we no longer have an error. I do need to pass a key prop. It doesn't really want it here. It really wants it here where I render stuff. So let's just do key equals t dot ID.
Does it matter that all the IDs are currently one?
It will for that key property, yeah. It might not break anything now, but it could. Thank you. And now if we check our console log, yep, encountering children with the same key, but that error should be gone. And now we're cooking. And just to make it a little more fun, I think what we'll do is let's make a is completed message. And we'll display that here instead. And nothing's done yet. We'll make one of these things completed just so we have something more interested. And it looks like I have Yeah, I'm not sure if there's an issue in the code. It looks like there might be because, yeah, we don't have to worry about props validation, but we've got ID, we've got name, we've got completed, but it doesn't seem to be working for stake. So let's just do a quick console log here. So for some reason, get state completed is still false. I suspect this may be an issue with I defined this stuff up here, but it's added as state here. So I'm not seeing the changes I make to this data reflected in the application. If I might need to do a refresh. Yeah. And now the stake is completed. So this is a little bit of a gotcha. Sort of in the interest of time, I put the data here, but because we load it in as top level React component state, when I'm making my changes, React isn't re-rendering the app component, or rather, it's not reloading this bit of component state because it doesn't need to. So I had to do a page refresh to force that. So we've got a to-do app here. It's looking pretty good. We didn't, if we go back to our design, we didn't need this task list component. Now we might want it later. Um, for all sorts of stuff. But for now, this is actually a pretty good start. And I think it's also useful to see how like adding this design here, and even though we didn't make this component, it's still useful to think about it. Um, I think I'll just add in a button and a text field for adding an image so that we have a little bit more stuff here to play with in our layout. And then we will start looking at Tailwind proper. So just to help keep things organized, I will put this in a div, even though it's empty right now. And I will make another div here. And in here, we'll have an input. And this will just be a text input. And then we'll have a button. And the button will say add task. And we'll make some state for the input field. And now I should have a controlled component. And if I go over here to my DevTools component tab and I look at the app, I can see indeed my state is updating the way that I want. And now we'll just add task. I also do need to deal with the ID, which we'll come to in just a minute. But let's make a make task function. And this is going to have to do a couple things. It's got to grab the task description, create a new JS object with a task. And in fact, maybe we want to do it. Well, we'll figure out what order we do it in. Add ID to the task. And we're going to need some sort of ID counter. And I am going to get a little hacky here just in the interests of time. So if we kind of go through this step by step, what I need to do is, first of all, I need to make a new task object. and its name needs to be that input value, right? That we've typed in. And we need to add an ID to the task. And I'm going to actually do a little bit of not quite a hack here, but I'm just going to say ID is tasks length +1. And I think that will actually take care of updating the ID counter because we're not using an ID counter, we're using the length of our tasks list. And then in here, I can do set tasks, and we're going to make a new array and destructure the current tasks array into it. And one moment, Carlos. And then add in our new task. Carlos, yes, sir.
Well, so that task dot length, I don't know, you said it was for the sake of time, but task dot length +1, that would only really work if we're not going to be removing any tasks, correct? Because then it kind of
Um,
throw the ID count off.
well, you raise an
With,
excellent point. Um, you
and I know you said it was
are,
for the sake of time, so
yep, yep, you're absolutely right. That's a good point because if I delete a task, like if I delete task 5, that's gone, and then I can add a task in, it would be ID 5 again. But really, we really what we care about is uniqueness of IDs. Um, it's actually okay to have IDs that aren't in sequential order. It's more important to make sure that the IDs are always going to be unique. And I think what you point out here, the risk is I delete this task, but now if I create another task, some new task has ID 5. And while in theory that should be okay, in practice, like maybe tasks aren't entirely deleted or something like that. It's better to like always have a fresh ID. So yeah, you're right. That could cause potential
yeah.
issues.
Yeah, because if you delete, like, for example, task ID, or yeah, 3, then whenever you add a new one, you still only have 4 on your list, so the next one's going to be 5. So then you have two with ID 5.
Oh, I see
Couldn't
what you're
you
saying. Yep, totally.
couldn't you
Okay.
just do math.max to grab the maximum ID in that map and then just add 1 to that and set that as the new ID?
We probably could. Um, I haven't used map.max a lot, but that sounds right. Um, this touches on a good point, which is actually, well, this is a little out of scope. The question is, do we want the ID to be essentially derived from the length of the task list? And the answer is actually no, we really do not. What we really want is we really want an ID counter, um, and that's separate because if we use, regardless of how sort of like smart we get with it, if we're deriving the ID from the length of the task list, I think it just opens up the door for potential problems. So we could do max, but really what I would recommend is like ID counter. And maybe we initialize it like this, and this way, set correctly. This is set correctly on a page refresh. But then over here, what we would want to do is something like this. Const new ID equals um in fact this gets a little tricky with React because state components don't update. React state doesn't necessarily update synchronously, so we have to be a little careful in how we do this. I would do ID counter +1 and then set the ID here. And then what we would do is we would also set, yeah, like this. This is not the best. But this, I think, in some ways is a safer way because it decouples ID from the length of the list a bit, if you guys see what I mean. Let's see if this works. So this does in fact not work. So let's see. Oh, well, it doesn't work for the best of all possible reasons that I haven't used the make task yet button yet. So let's add an on click here. And now let's see if this works. And there we go. We've added another task. Um, I'm not going to get into deleting a task or updating task statuses, all of which would be great to do, which we could do by passing down like a method into here, right? But like if I had, I'll just demo the flow without implementing it. Let's just say like const update, but let's call it flip task status. And actually, I guess we can't, yeah, I'm not gonna do it. I'm not gonna implement it because I'll end up making a bug. But I just to show the pass through, because I know this was something that folks mentioned last week. What we could do here is in our task component, we also pass a flip task status function. And the reason we do this is because the tasks live up here, right? If I add in, let's add in some React component state in red. So just because we've passed this state down as props into individual tasks, um, doesn't mean that over here I can just change this value. I need to change the value where this data lives, which is in component state. So I would pass this function down because over here I can do something like, this. Um, tasks filter. There's undoubtedly a better way to do that, but I could get the desired task based on like a task ID by, in here if I wanted to call this. And so then I can pass down a function that I can then use to change the status of any task, but changing it in the parent's state. And I just want to pause in and see what questions folks have or what folks might be kind of curious about with this warm up before we really dive into the Tailwind stuff. Because I know that we've seen this, right? This is what you guys are doing with React Hangman, and the other problems for last week. But I think it can be helpful to review and also to kind of see the flow of building it out live. So I just want to check in and see what questions people have or what's on people's minds. And is it useful to sort of like review and go over this way?
I like it.
Cool. And do folks have any questions around what I was talking about here with this flip task status function and passing it in like this? Because this is sort of a key React pattern. Okay, awesome. And in fact, we can build this out, I think, like real quick. If we add, what is it? Like an input type checkbox. And then can someone remind me for a checkbox, what is it? Is it value that determines if it's checked or not? Well, I'm actually not sure. No, that's not what I want. This is what I want. Um, oh, it's just a Boolean named checked. And so we would do checked and we would set completed. And if we go to our code, it looks like, well, of course, I have to close out my input tag. That would certainly help. And we see that the stake is done. And now what I really want to do here is I want to add an on change. I'm going to make a handle check method. Oh, excuse me. I had my caps lock on, which messes up all the Vim keyboard shortcuts. And I'm just going to console log this real quick. I just want to make sure that this is working. So it's working, but note that because the checkbox is a controlled component, because its checked status is set from this Boolean, which is coming from the parent state of our task here. In order to get this to change, I need to change the parent state. And so what I want to do here is call this flip task status method and pass in the ID of my task. And with luck, no, it did not quite work. Oh, probably because I'm not actually doing anything in here. So let's make sure I've got my desired task. That's always a good start. So indeed, I get the right task when I click on the thing, which is always good to double check. And now we can make our change. Um, we'll make an updated task. And I think what we'll do is just for simplicity, we will say ID equals desired task dot ID, name desired task dot name, and then completed is going to be the opposite of our desired task completion status. Um,
After completed, you need a
oh
colon,
yeah,
I think.
thank you.
The left hand completed.
Oh, thank you. And now this actually does start to get a little tricky because what I really need is, and this is where I may pause, to be honest, because I need to update this array of objects and I need to get rid of the I need to get rid of the old version of the task and replace it with a new one. So this is like a terrible hack. So forgive me, but I'm just doing this sort of quickly in the interest of time. Um, so first we got to get the desired task and update its status by making an updated task. And there's probably a better way to do this. But now let's get the task, get all the tasks without the old desired task. And for this, what I'm just going to do is we're going to call this other tasks. And so this will give me all the other tasks. And now we're going to update task state to have new task. And as I said, this is a bit hacky, for which I apologize. And let's add in a console log here just to make sure that this is working. And now we add in our updated task. So there might be a more clever way to do this, taking the advantage of the fact that there's an array of objects. But this way we actually create like a whole new array with a new object for our updated task. If I implemented this correctly. And so indeed we see it sure looks like it's working, but let's double check. If we click on stake, we look at other tasks, we see everything is here except for stake. And then if we look at the new version, we see that stake is completed. Now there is an ordering issue here in the way I've implemented this, in that like something gets added to the end, but I'm not gonna worry about that for now. And I just want to pause here and see if folks have any questions around like the logic that we did here, or if there's like a cleaner way that's jumping like to mind, just let me know. Just sort of doing this on the spot. This was sort of the simplest, fastest path, but there's undoubtedly a nicer implementation. Cool. Okay, so we're definitely warmed up now, including myself. Um, we have been going for a while though. Why don't we take a short break? Let's take 10 actually. And then when we come back, we'll look at Tailwind. And now that we have this task app, we can start adding things and applying Tailwind to like an actual project. And we can add some nice styling of images and add some Flexbox layout to it. Sound good? All right. Thank you very much, everyone. And I'll see you all in 10 minutes. All right. So we've properly warmed up, including me, getting my Monday brain back into code mode. We've written a simple to-do app. We actually implemented a lot. It took a little while, but now we have some really nice HTML to work with and style here as we learn Tailwind. So there's a couple steps here for Tailwind for installation. It's going to depend on what framework you're using and what build tool you're using. Since we're using Vite and React, we're going to follow the Vite build instructions. I do also want to point out one thing that's actually really important up here where it says Tailwind V4, V4.1. Tailwind switched from version 3 to version 4 maybe a couple months ago, maybe 6 months ago, but it wasn't that long ago. And so there's still some Tailwind version 3 stuff floating around out there, but the way that you install Tailwind and use Tailwind has changed. So as you're working with Tailwind, just make sure that you're looking at Tailwind version 4 docs and references and working off version 4. And if you're seeing like conflicting ways of doing things, it could be that you're looking at version 3 instead of version 4. So there's a couple things involved with Tailwind installation. We're going to install Tailwind in our NPM project. We're going to configure Tailwind in our NPM project, and we're going to install Tailwind VS Code extensions. And there's two of them. They're listed in the curriculum. One is like Tailwind IntelliSense, and the other I think is called Tailwind Fold. We'll see them in just a minute. The Tailwind IntelliSense is officially supported by Tailwind, and both of these make life a whole lot easier. So there's not a ton of work, but there are a couple things that we need to do so that we can have a good working Tailwind setup and workflow. So just going off this right off the bat, and the Tailwind docs here are a good guide. Step 1 is we're going to install Tailwind, and I'm just going to copy this command of theirs. And I'm in my project root directory, and I'm going to install. Note that this npm install command is a little more complex. We're working off of the Tailwind CSS. We're installing two packages, actually. We're installing Tailwind CSS. We're installing two things at once. And this @ symbol is what's called an npm namespace. And there's different, like there's Tailwind CSS Vite, there's other ones. So this full thing is its own npm package that we're installing. And this is stuff specific to Vite that's going to make working with Tailwind super easy with Vite and is definitely the way to go. So both these guys are installed. It's added, they should be added to the package JSON and the package lock.json. I am going to open up the editor here so I can make sure that I'm opening up the right Vite config file. Because I have a couple different projects open and I don't want to use Command-Shift-P to go to the wrong directory. So now that we've installed Tailwind, we do need to modify this vite.config.js file that we normally don't touch. And what we need to do is pretty simple. We import the Tailwind CSS package that we just installed. And we want to make sure we import from @Tailwind CSS/Vite. And this is a function that we'll call here right after React in this plugins array. And I'll make sure I got the name right. Yep, everything looking good. And now Vite will run whatever the heck that code is inside that function when Vite starts up a project, so that Tailwind is working. And it does a bunch of stuff under the hood. There's some fancy stuff that Vite does with like CSS and the build process that's a little out of scope for us. And then the last thing we have to do, and this is extremely important, is in index.css, we need to add a CSS import statement. So in CSS, especially using this tool called Post CSS that adds all these fancy features to CSS, and Post CSS gets a version of it gets installed with the Tailwind package, basically, that plays nice with Vite. We can import stuff, and we're going to import all of the Tailwind CSS. And we're going to import it into our index.js, the one that gets loaded here in main. And this way, index.css, excuse me. And this way it gets loaded first and it takes precedence and we have access to it everywhere in our app. And if we need to add our own CSS classes here for any reason, this app.css file can sort of be more focused. But as we're going to see in just a minute, we can do an awful lot with Tailwind. So just to recap, the install steps were install the npm package, add Tailwind CSS here to the Vite config, and then add Tailwind CSS here in index.css. And I just want to see if folks have any questions. Cool. So I'm going to run the dev server to make sure I didn't do something wrong, and then we'll tackle the VS Code extensions. So my dev server is running. I'm not using Tailwind yet, but nothing is broken and nothing is complaining too much. There is this complaint about at import rules, but I think we'll be okay. If not, we'll find out in just a minute. Let me go ahead and get a little more real estate here, and then we can install these extensions because these are really important. And I have way too many things down here, but if we go to extensions and we search for Tailwind, we see a couple things. So this one, I do recommend Tailwind docs. Um, and I think the easiest thing is just search for Tailwind in the VS Code extensions. And in general, if extension doesn't have at least a couple 100,000 installs, you probably don't want to install it. So now we can access the Tailwind docs more easily. And I guess if we do Command Shift P and we search for Tailwind docs, it'll find stuff for us, which can be useful to have. This is the one we really need by Tailwind Labs, Tailwind CSS IntelliSense. And this will give us autocomplete, syntax highlighting, and linting. So when we're typing in all these Tailwind class names, they're not just going to be magic strings. We're going to actually get some editor help. And we only care about v4. Installation is very simple. Basically, all you need to do is install it and have installed Tailwind the way that we showed. And then finally, the third one you'll want to install is this library called Tailwind Fold. I'll show you all what this does in a minute. You may, in the beginning, want to disable this. Right? It's pretty easy to disable and re-enable a VS Code extension. Sometimes you need to restart VS Code. A lot of the times you don't. We'll see what this is in a moment, but in essence, we have a whole lot of classes, and this kind of compacts them. There's a whole bunch of other things. There's snippets, which could be useful, but I haven't used. I don't think the color generator is really useful. I wouldn't worry too much about the rest of this for now, unless there's something that really catches your eye. Do folks have any questions around the VS Code extensions? Okay, awesome. Let's get to tailwinding. Let's go ahead and close this out. Go here and go to our app. So, what makes Tailwind so cool? What makes Tailwind great is it has all sorts of utility libraries to do all sorts of CSS for us. For instance, if we start with some of the simplest things we might want to do, like say typography for a font family, if I want to set the fonts to be mono for a whole bunch of stuff, I can just use this class named font mono. And you can see here they have really nice examples of how to use Tailwind for all of these things. So let's go ahead and let's change the fonts for our whole app. And let's go ahead and change this in app.jsx. Let's make this a div instead of a fragment so I can apply some styles to everything. And this is that really nice autocomplete from that Tailwind IntelliSense. And what's really cool is you can in fact see here the CSS class. There's some fancy stuff going on with CSS variables, but in essence, we should now be changing the font of everything here to mono, which is great. So there's a bunch of things we can do with fonts and typography. Let's see here. I may need to get a little more space. Font size is a great example. Note that there's extra small, small, what's called a base size, a large size, extra large, 2XL, and so on. And you'll see this in almost every single CSS library there. And if you dig around in the CSS for Tailwind, you'll see that there's like a font value. I'm not sure if it's set in pixels or maybe rem, but basically sort of preset settings for font sizes that have like a good spatial relationship to each other.
If
And you
you,
can see the example here. Oh,
sorry, if you
yes.
scroll over, sorry, if you scroll up a little bit, if you scroll over to the right, it actually defines it. It's by rem.
Oh, it is by rem? Oh, even better. Let's see here. Oh, it does define it 6 rem. Yup. So it's relative to the base font for the entire HTML document. And let's go ahead and let's add in some of these fonts. Maybe 2XL. How about 4XL? I think that's looking good. Um, and now if we go to our task, this H4, I think I want to make it a little bigger. Maybe too large. And I'm curious, let's see here, if we do something responsive, does it change? And so indeed it does. So you'll see this not just with fonts, but with padding, margin, anything that you can kind of set in pixels. Tailwind is probably going to have like sort of pre-configured settings. And this is a good thing. This is like pretty much every modern CSS library offers this, and it makes our lives way, way easier. So I recommend wholeheartedly embracing this. So let's see just a couple other things when it comes to typography that we've got here. Um, let's see how about like text decoration and underline. And if I want to underline something, I can just use a class named underline. So here, and so this, folks, you all see this sort of squiggly, this sort of weird curly symbol and the 3 dots right here. This is that Tailwind fold VS Code extension that you may or may not want to have activated. And the reason is because with Tailwind, you tend to get a whole lot of classes. Oh, and that might have been too much offset. And I'm not, to be honest, I'm not sure what the offset modifier does to underline, so we won't use it. But you can see here that like as we start adding typography, there's a whole bunch of stuff that we can do here. For instance, font weight is a really good one. Maybe let's do like a semi-bold or a bold font. Right? Or if we go bold, bold, just to really emphasize it. Well, it still looks about the same. And so, in fact, if I want to go to my task and maybe I decide that I want to have a span, And I just need to put the span in the right spot. And so again, you can start to see how once you get used to Tailwind, it can make life a whole lot easier because I don't have to create this CSS class. I can use the ones they have. And for stuff like this, that can actually save a lot of time. And I just want to check in to see if folks have any questions before we keep rolling. I'm going to demo colors in just a minute, and then like padding and layout, and then or padding and margin, and then we'll take a look at Flexbox. Andy, yes, sir.
Does the Tailwind support like animations and whatnot, or is that when you're just gonna have to rely on your OG CSS?
Yeah, great question. It does have pseudo classes. So for things like hovering, where if you hover over something, it will change a color or do stuff. Um, it has an awful lot, to be honest. Like this is not an animation, but it has stretch. It may, let's see, background. Here we go, transitions and animations. I actually have never really used this with Tailwind. Um, this is actually pretty nifty. I've never actually looked at this before, but to be honest, I feel like this is kind of immediately useful. It looks like they're maybe creating an SVG here of a certain size and then adding a spinner to it. And an SVG, something vector graphic, it's a way of generating an image. So it's essentially sort of creating an empty box that it's putting the animation on. And it looks like they have a whole bunch here, which is actually pretty cool. For the fancier stuff with CSS, you indeed might have to add your own. And just to test if this works, let's just grab this and let's put this little bounce thing maybe like right by our add task button. If we go to app.jsx and we've got the add task button, let's try putting this. It's not really going to work because it's not going to be above it, but just to see if there's anything fancy that we need to do here or not. And this probably needs to go.
Is it class name instead of class?
Oh yeah, thank you so much. And that is the danger of copy paste. And it still doesn't seem to work, which is a bit of a shame because I was really hoping that it would. Um, you know what? It's there. It just needs a color, maybe. So I'm not, this is where, and you can see, I was going to show this on the other elements in a minute, but you can see how Tailwind does colors. You have to add a color weight. Like let's do text blue 500. Yeah, I don't think it's
I,
going to work for that, unfortunately.
I think you need to probably put an element inside of the SVG because I don't think it's currently being operated on anything or whatever you would call that.
Yeah, I'm not really sure because with the SVG, it should be its own elements. Um, and because we're not seeing this here, it's I don't want to get too lost in the sauce here because I don't know enough about the SVG to get it to work right. Um, but we can see that it is in fact animating. I'm just not doing something right with like the display of this thing. You know what I mean? So I might try and poke around with it later, or if someone wants to poke around with it later. I'm sure it's a relatively easy fix, but we see that the animation here working. Um, my guess is it might just be like a color issue, to be totally honest. But this is actually pretty cool to see. Um, yeah, because I know what you mean. It looks like there should be something inside there. And again, I'm not very good with SVGs, so I don't know what needs to happen, what may need to happen in here.
Could you just add the oh, never mind. We're trying to get that bouncing arrow. I was gonna say just add that animation to the button. Would that make the button just bounce around?
Uh, I don't think it would make the button bounce, but let's find out.
Sorry, I meant more of just adding the class name to the button,
Oh,
what we had on the SVG.
good question. I don't know if that'll work. Because the examples that I'm seeing here are where they're adding at these attributes to non-SVG elements. But you might be right. Let's see what happens here. Animate bounce. So let's give it a class name. Yeah, and like we can give it a border. So that's interesting. Oh, I added it to the wrong element and it is totally working. Here, let's go ahead and add it to the button. So that was a great idea. I had assumed that the SVG part was important, but it looks like it's actually not. And so in fact, we can go ahead and animate bounce everything. So this is actually kind of awesome, right? And then we have the spinners and everything else. That was a great call. Thank you so much. I totally assumed here because we were seeing uh they were adding it to an SVG element that it needed to be. But if we look at this example here, like with the pulse, and some of the other ones, they just add it to whatever. So you're absolutely correct. And I think the problem with this example may have just been maybe the SVG has to have an arrow. So there we go. We've got a bouncing app, which is actually kind of awesome. So I'm not gonna code it up now, but because this is a class name, this could be a variable, right? And so when you hover, you could have the bouncing stop by changing that variable's name to something else. So you could do some really cool animation and stuff with this. So let me show, I wanted to show color, and I think this one's good to see. When you're doing text color, you have to do text dash and then the color name. And you can't just give a name, you need to give it a weight. This is probably the most common gotcha. And you can see here, they've put together a color scale that's quite nice. And I do recommend using it. Um, so for instance, in a task over here, I could do, you know, const task color equals completed. And how about text green 500? And if it's not completed, we'll do text red 500. And then over here, we'll add, we got to do a little modification, but we'll make this a template literal. So now I can intersperse text with code by using this escape character, and we'll do task color. And now the steak and the peanut butter we've got, and they're green, but the other ones are red. Right. And again, this is really nice. Like, I don't have to define my own color system. They've had, people who know design come up with good color weights and stuff like that. So, again, hopefully, are you guys starting to get a sense of like the sort of utility value of Tailwind to help sort of like accelerate using CSS? Awesome. Yeah, Tailwind is honestly pretty awesome. I am not an expert at it. It became popular really after I joined Code Platoon a couple years ago, though it was around for a bit, and so I just didn't get tons and tons of professional experience with it. But there is so much stuff that you can do. It has, I didn't even know about the animation stuff. Um, it has so many different things, right? So many different things. And in fact, let's tackle border, right? Because our tasks should have some border. And I think we're going to want some border width. And we can see here that we can do it in pixels. Um, if we just wanted, I'll show how to do like just top or bottom in a minute with X and Y. I'll show that with padding. But we can see here these numbers, it looks like they've set some weights to them. And then we can set colors as well. And if we wanted to do individual parts of a border, we would use border R, border L, and so on. But let's just keep this simple and let's give our tasks a border of, how about border 4? And how about, oh, that indigo does kind of look nice. And now indeed, actually, we really could use some spacing. So here's one of the great tricks of CSS design. I think people can really struggle with how do I do layout and handle margin and padding. And this was taught to me by a manager of mine at a startup I was at before joining here. The things to think about is margin bottom and margin right. Because if you take care of these correctly, then it trickles down, right? And let me show you what I mean. Let's do margin bottom 1. How about 2? There we go. So people can struggle with, do I set margin bottom? Do I set margin top? If you set margin bottom, you don't need to worry about margin top nearly as enough because you've got, the bottom of one thing is the top of the other. So always start with margin bottom and margin right. And again, the reason is the CSS flow, the document flow, right, is left to right and with blocks going top to bottom. So if you start with that margin bottom and that margin right with your boxes, then you will be able to make good layouts much more simply. Cool. And I think we should do a little bit of padding. In fact, as I'm looking at, this H4 and this checkbox, I'm distinctly feeling like we need some padding here. So let's do padding left 1. I think we need more. Padding left 2. How about padding left 4? I think that's looking pretty good. I think we actually want some padding top and bottom too. So let's do padding Y for top and bottom, and let's try 1. And I think that's looking pretty good. And I could further customize it if I wanted, right? Let's in fact go to this button. And I think the button clearly needs some padding. But first, following the rules, let's add some margin right here to this input field. So let's do margin right of 1. I think that looks pretty good. Let's make it maybe 2. In fact, let's make it 4. And now for our button, let's give the button, how about border of 2 and a border, oh man, border black, 400. And now I think we also need some padding. Let's add some left and right padding. Let's make it really big of like 4. And let's add just a little bit of top padding. Right? And now the button's a little bigger than the input field, but we have a pretty nice looking thing, especially with this autumn animation. And this is also why this fold VS Code plugin is useful. So hopefully that's a really good preview of sort of like text manipulation and layout and how to control it either by, applying it to the top, bottom, left, right for layout related things, or, font weight and color weight and so on. I just want to check in to see if folks have any questions, and then I think maybe we'll take a break and then we'll look at Flexbox. Carlos, yes, sir.
So this to me looks like it's just inline CSS. And one of the issues with inline CSS is you can't really kind of keep it uniform throughout your project because you run the risk of skipping 1 or 2 class names in here and just making everything look different. Is there a way to manage that?
Right. Great question. You mean like if I want all my buttons to look the same way?
Would you just have to go like the plain CSS route and just create
Yeah.
class names and stuff like that?
Great
Like your own
question.
class name?
Well, what we would do is I would probably make a button component the same way if I look at this task component. Um, like I could use this for all sorts of things, right? Um, if I wanted to have all my buttons look like that um, with the same styling, I might just and let's go ahead and give a little space here. Let me type this up. My button. Let me get rid of that semicolon that I'm sure there's a better way to deal with. And then what I would do over here, let's just copy this. Let's get rid of that. The on click, we're obviously going to have to replace with something else. Let's just call it on click handler. And let's just assume that that gets passed in as a prop. And let's also maybe have, we'll just call it message. And so now I have a button component and it's simple, but that's okay. Just like with Python, like there's nothing wrong with making really small classes that do one specific job. And in fact, the smaller the better because it's easier to work with. So making a button component that does one specific job is totally fine. And so now if I sort of want to standardize how buttons look, I can do it like this. Is that sort of what you were wondering about?
Yes, sir. That's exactly it. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. Great question. And you're right that that's one of the challenges. And this is kind of one of the awesome ways where you can combine Tailwind and React. With Bootstrap, Bootstrap gives us button components that are already styled. So Tailwind is a little bit more like roll your own. But here I can very quickly, I mean, you guys saw how quick that was. Start to make sort of like standardized UI components as I build out my app. And in fact, I think it's a great way to go. The rule for when to make an abstraction like this, right? Because now I have a button abstraction. And the challenge here is, what if I need something fancier to happen with the on click? What if I need to mess with multiple properties? Um, there's stuff you can do to pass in sort of props more dynamically, but a good rule is the rule of three, right? Once you repeat yourself 3 times, then make an abstraction. So, if you have like, and frankly, even the rule of four, I think is fine. If I have like 3 buttons that all just I copy and paste this class name, I think that's fine. If I have a fourth button, at that point, I might say, all right, I'm going to make this abstraction. Yeah, great question. What other questions do folks have, or what else is on people's minds? Okay, awesome. We've covered a lot of ground with Tailwind, and Tailwind has a whole lot, right? We looked at borders. We didn't even look at effects, but it has all these awesome CSS effects with shading and box shadowing. And again, the great thing here is they've put together a design system. Everything is proportional. Um, you can set, you can use different units. Like this is sort of a 1/20th, like a fractional approach versus 1, 2, and 3, and so on. Let's see here. We don't need to talk about transforms. We'll talk about this. I'm not going to demo this, but there's stuff for controlling scroll and all sorts of things. Again, I think it really is worth looking through these docs for a bit. We've seen most of the text stuff. There's background color stuff, of course, and things for background images. And I can set background colors with BG dash the color name and the color weight. A lot of stuff for text control. A lot of stuff for font control. We didn't see width. I do want to point out with width, height, and with padding and margin. We have the sort of built-in sizings that are based off of, it looks like it's based off of rem, and it's using a CSS variable to calculate it, which is really nice because all of my width sizings, or for instance, if you look at padding, they don't show the rems here. So I will show you guys because I think this is good to see and their visuals are very useful. They have a lot of different ways of adding padding. We talked about top, bottom, left, right, and this is all true for margin as well. We saw the horizontal and vertical padding. Um, we can add like left to right, right to left, inline start padding number sizes. We'll talk about breakpoints in a little bit. Um, when we see, this is a little bit of a preview, and I think this is probably a good stopping point. Um, Tailwind sets up a sort of a grid system of sort of dividing the page into a grid with a width of 96. And we can kind of tell it like what granularity of that grid we want to use. Or we can set width based on that grid. We can also do width full or width 1/2 or width 2/5. And again, we can do this with height. I think we can do it with margin and padding, but I'm not certain. And where this really comes in useful, and we'll implement this after the break, is with Flexbox, where once you combine that sort of grid layout and these preset settings in Flexbox, you can get like very nice layout very quick. So on that note, why don't we take 10? I know we've kind of been taking our time, but we've been covering a lot of ground here. When we come back after the break, we'll talk about Flexbox and layout, and we'll talk a little bit about media breakpoints and pseudo classes. Bootstrap is not going to be as sort of in-depth as Tailwind. I'm going to really focus on Bootstrap Grid and probably the Bootstrap navbar. We might run out of time for this demo, but I think with everything that we're seeing today, it sets you guys up really well. And then we'll have a really nice contrast between the sort of roll your own lighter weight approach of Tailwind and the more batteries included approach of Bootstrap. So let's take a 10-minute break, and then when we come back, we'll see Flexbox layout with Tailwind. All right, thank you very much, everyone, and see you all in 10 minutes. All right, so we've dove pretty deep into Tailwind, right? We've hit installation. Got like 3 categories there. We've done a pretty deep dive. We've gone well beyond basic styling of text. We kind of jumped ahead to layout. Now we're going to take a look at Flexbox. And to do this, I think a good starting point could be this button element. I think we're gonna want to do a couple things with Flexbox. So let me tell you what we're gonna build, and then we'll look at it in we'll look at Flexbox and Tailwind. So first off, this button here, you know, and our text, what I really want is I really want a nice big fat checkbox and a message, and I want some sort of nice proportion, right? Maybe like 1/3 to 2/3. I also think what I want is when we make this small enough, just for fun, I think I want to change the ordering or the row orientation here of the add task button and the input field rather than being 2 items in a row. I think I want them to collapse into a column. And I think that's a pretty good set of goals because that gives us some flex layout as well as we can add in some media breakpoints and stuff. You know, there's a lot of nice little things we could do here for quality of life for styling. For instance, it might be nice to add in some like padding on the left and right here. In fact, it might be nice to make that maybe a padding of 1. I think that it improves the look and feel of the app dramatically, right? In fact, maybe even 2. We might even want some padding on the top. Maybe we want the padding top to be 2 as well. Right. And I think that makes our app look very nice. Let's take a look at Flexbox. And let me go ahead and kind of have this take up space for a minute. Because Tailwind's Flexbox is pretty amazing. So it has this term basis that we can use to set the initial size of flex items based on, I think the grid is actually 128 in total. And if we look at this example here, we see we have 3 divs, right? But because we're using the flex row class, they're displayed in a row. And we see here this relation of, my apologies, the total grid size is probably 256 if I'm adding all these up, which makes sense. We can probably make it as fine-grained as we want, because under the hood, Tailwind is kind of doing the arithmetic for us here. And so we see here the Tailwind Flexbox classes to set display to flex, and then to set the flex direction with flex row. And then we see for each item, each flex item, we can set a basis to tell it how much size we want it to take up, right? So 64, 64, 128. We can also use, they have extra small, 3XS, 2XS, 2 extra small, small, medium, and then they have fractional percentages. And again, under the hood, Flexbox calculates them all to the same thing. It's really just a question of which measure is more useful for your use case. And for ours, let's see, we don't need my button since we're not using it. For task, let's go ahead here. We're going to add, forgive me as I get my pointer where I want it. We're going to add the flex row classes. And that was very interesting. It certainly shrunk up a lot of stuff. And then, well, I've got the H4 and I've got the input field. I think what I'm actually going to do is I actually want the input field to go first. So we have a checkbox here. I actually think I want to wrap this in a div. And I think I want, let's have the background be, how about, let's have it also be indigo, maybe 400. And it would help if I closed my div. And it would help if I put the closing tag for the div where I want it to be, which is right here. So now this input checkbox is wrapped in a div. So this is nice, but this doesn't take up a lot of space, right? So I think what I want to do here now is use this flex basis property. And I think I want the basis here to be 1/3. And I want the basis here for this H4 to be 2/3. I think we should also maybe try some justify content to see if we can't get that checkbox in the center. Let's see if it's, we actually just might want text. Actually, I might need to look this up real quick. Tailwind center checkbox in Flexbox item. It's either going to be align content. Even better. There's an items center. So that's kind of what I was looking for. I knew it was center something. That does not, oh, wrong spot. No, actually it should go there.
You're doing vertical.
You had a
align.
typo as well. It was,
Oh, I did.
yes.
Thank you. Let's try it again.
Item center is vertical alignment, not horizontal.
Oh, thank you. What's the horizontal alignment?
It says justify center for horizontal.
Justify center. Okay, so maybe. Yeah, the other issue here may be the flex display property is not on the div wrapping the input element. It's on the parent. I don't know if I may need to add it here as well if we're going to use justify center. Yeah, there we go. So I think there's a way to do this without Flexbox with like a text align property or something, but this is not the worst to do justify center. And this is not the world's most beautiful layout, but I just wanted to kind of get some Flexbox demonstration in action. So now we've got that. Frankly, this padding on the left here is kind of ugly. And I think we're gonna change it to like 0.5. I think that's much better. I'll worry about the rest of this later. Otherwise, I'll get a little too sucked into making the layout look nice. But you can see how with the Tailwind classes, how easy that becomes. So there's a lot of different ways we can set that basis, right? And in fact, if we go to app.jsx here, what we really want is I want this H1 and probably these to be sort of like this is a column, this is this is a column, and that all this stuff is a column. So I want a flex row of going vertically of 3 columns. So let's add flex column. And there's not a lot I have to do with these right now because everything kind of looks pretty good. But just for fun, I think what I'll also do is let's do flex column because very clearly our task items here are, a number of items. And so now these have the flex display property on them as well. Now I can start to play around with layout though. And in fact, maybe I want to start using the flex basis again and percentages now that I have these columns. And I might just use the fractional ones again. Maybe I want, or let's use the grid system just so we can mix it up. Let's try kind of doing what they did here. Let's have this be basis 64. That is clearly way too big. So let's try, instead of 64, let's try like 16. So that seems much more reasonable. So that's our H1. And then we've got this containing div here. And let's have this also be basis 16. And now, if we're sort of following the rules of proportionality here, let's have this container here be basis. Let's try maybe like 48. So it's 3 times as big, right? 16 versus 48. I wonder what happens if we add a flex base, if we add a basis here of basis 16. So now it starts to get a lot more interesting, right? Because now all of a sudden everything is proportional. And indeed, I needed to add the basis on the items. I would have to double check about how the basis gets applied, but I think it's still relating to the above items. So this is pretty cool. And this is just sort of showing the different ways of using Flexbox. Now, let's talk about breakpoints. And before I dive into that, let me just see if folks have any questions. How are we feeling about Flexbox with Tailwind? Pretty good? Okay, awesome. So can someone remind me what a breakpoint is? I know we talked about them last week, but just very briefly as a reminder.
Conditional formatting based on screen size.
Yeah, exactly. And we can have breakpoints, in fact, on a whole bunch of other factors. That's why it's technically called like a media query, where it can look at a whole bunch of different properties of the display. And it looked something like, oh man, I don't remember exactly the syntax, but it was media. And then we did, something here where we said, basically, 1440 pixels or whatever. And then we would set our class property here, like, my button size, with 4 pixels or what have you. So the good news is we don't have to manually set these in CSS. Flexbox provides these for us. There's an MD here, which is short for a medium breakpoint. And so there's extra small, medium, and large breakpoints. And in fact, if we search for Tailwind breakpoints, somewhere in here they have a table that actually shows. This is for customizing your own breakpoints. There it is. So under responsive design, which is a good starting point in the Tailwind docs, they tell you what the prefixes are for the different breakpoints. And these are pretty standard. My guess is bootstraps are similar, if not the same. And you can see here they're basing them in rem, where again, that sort of default font size is a really useful base unit to make everything else relative to. And so we've got small, medium, large, extra large, and 2XL. And so what I can do is this is sort of the default setting, but then I can add rules for different breakpoints, and I can add any rule that I want. So if we put this over here and we hop back over here and let's look at our checkbox, I could say MD, maybe like basis 1/6, so half as much space. And then over here, I could do MD basis. Let's make it 1/3. Actually, it should be even bigger. It should be 5/6. And hopefully this can handle sixths as fractions. We will see in just a minute. Let's make this responsive and see what happens. So I'm not sure if that breakpoint is getting applied. Let me try. Let's make this like small. Yeah, it might not be. Let's try changing it to like basis. Maybe basis like 16. And over here, let's change this to small and change this to basis 4. There we go. So yeah, this is where it gets interesting. I think part of the problem is I have this thing so small. So it looks like what's happening is it hits that small breakpoint, which must be around here, and then it sets it going further out. So if I pull up my code, let's make a change here where, and let's give ourselves a little space. And this can be a little tricky because the issue is sort of like what's the default breakpoint setting and what triggers it. I would have expected the small one to be a bit smaller, but what we can do here is let's do large basis 2/3. And then over here for our checkbox div, let's do large basis 1/3. Let's see what happens. There we go. So this is where small is, which is a little confusing because to be honest, to me, that's still pretty sizable. And you can in fact see when we move out of the small range into what must be extra small, it goes back to our default basis setting. But it looks like once you hit that breakpoint, you need to set another one because we stay through the medium, we're still on that setting, and then we hit the large, and then it goes up. So once you start setting the responsive breakpoints, you kind of it can be kind of useful to set it for more of them. For instance, like we probably want to do let's make this, we can leave the small there, but let's do like medium, basis 1/3. Let's do extra small, basis 4. And then over here, let's do, sorry, here we go. Over here, let's do the same thing where we're going to do extra small, basis 16, and then medium, basis 2/3. And in fact, I probably just need the extra small, 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 and medium settings. And it looks like the extra small might not be being triggered for some reason. Though again, it's a little tricky here because I might need more real estate, but we can see here we hit medium now. And we're getting to those really big breakpoints where we could add more if we wanted. Here we hit the small breakpoint, and I'm not sure why the extra small didn't get applied there, to be honest. I may have a typo or something. But the nice thing is that you can do this for everything, not just sizes and widths. So for instance, over here, if we go back to app.jsx and we look at this input field and this button, I want them to turn into a row after a certain point. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do flex, and I'm going to do, let's maybe do extra small flex column, and let's do large flex row. And let's see what happens. And let me do a refresh here just to make sure I haven't done anything silly. And it looks like for some reason the extra small is not getting hit. There we go. So I'm not sure what's up with the extra small breakpoint. In fact, it doesn't, I might be typing it wrong or something like that. We can see it's here, but we can see here I hit small, medium, and then I go to large and it goes like this. So you can use that for anything. You can use it for colors. You could use it for whatever you want. So any styling you can apply like these breakpoint rules to very flexibly. And I just want to check in and see if folks have any questions around that. Okay, awesome. Let's take a look at hover and pseudo classes and dark mode, and then we'll take a short break and look at React components, which I realize I've eaten into a bit of time here on. So hover and focus are pretty straightforward. I can choose whatever element I want, like say this input element, and I could add, let's say on focus, maybe I want to make the background color like that. And now I click there, and let me make this unresponsive. So I click there, and we can see that that changes. And similarly, if I want a hover on my button, I can just do hover and add a color to it. And we can do something very similar with the task element. And maybe I also want to change the border color when I hover. And make it really dark, like indigo 800. And so I can use pseudo classes and all of those tools the same way. And I just want to pause and see if folks have any questions about hover and pseudo classes. Carlos, yes, sir.
I'm assuming there's no way to chain the properties like on hover. Do you have to do hover for every property you want to change?
Um, oh,
I
you mean
mean, if you,
like add individual hover statements? Like
yeah, so like could you
this?
do background sky 200 and then border indigo 800 without having to do hover colon for every single property you want to change?
I don't know. Let's see if it works. I think it's actually a bit better to have them separate. It
Okay.
seems like more work. Let's see if it lets us do it. No, that doesn't seem to work.
Okay.
Again, the advantage here is like if you're repeating this a whole bunch of times, you're probably going to have sort of a wrapper component like we saw with the button where we kind of make our own ready-made UI component. You know what I mean? Um, and also, again, like often you may want to like programmatically control bits of it. So this isn't too bad because you won't be typing this out a bunch of times. Like if you're typing this out more than 3 times, you might just make like a wrapper component of some sort.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah, totally. But yeah, it doesn't look like Tailwind. Let's just do that. All right, let's take a quick look at dark mode because this is actually quite cool. So Tailwind has great support for dark mode, and it's pretty easy to set up. Um, Basically, you can define different classes that get used in dark mode, and so it's a media query under the hood. And if you look at this example here, you see this dark colon BG gray 800. And over here it says BG white. So this says in light mode, have the background be white, but in dark mode, have the background be gray. Now, these days browsers can like pay attention to the operating system setting of if the user wants dark mode or not, which is a media feature, and thus this is a media breakpoint. And Tailwind is already set up to do this using the prefers color scheme CSS media feature, which is the one that I guess the operating system interacts with. But we're going to see how to toggle dark mode manually, which is cool. And it does involve 2 steps. Step one is we have to add this argument here where we're basically overriding the dark variant to use our own CSS selector. And I just copied and pasted this in, and basically it's going to look for dark. And then what we can do is once this is here, and let me go ahead and pull up my app. I can set the background to white. No biggie, it's already set to white. I can say for dark mode, let's make the background black. Again, no biggie. But now if I add in the dark class, then we see that switch get flipped, which is very cool, right? And of course, this can be a variable. So there could be a button that the user clicks or a toggle switch or what have you. And that could set it whether it's dark mode or not. Like, let's go up here and just add a bit of component state. We'll set it to false by default. And then over here, I've got to make this the curly brackets and a template literal. And now over here, we have a dark mode that we can flip the switch on. Now you do have to manually set the different dark mode settings that you want for things. And so again, this is where, like, you know, as your app gets bigger, you probably do want to create some sort of button class or stuff like that. But also, you know, if you set certain things at the top level, they trickle down. But for instance, if in dark mode, I want to change text color, I'm not sure how far that will trickle down. If we do dark text shadow white, let's see what happens if we set dark mode to true. And let's just do, we'll just be lazy and put it right there. So it looks like I've run into, I might just have a typo here. Oh, I've triggered an infinite loop because I think I'm just constantly setting this each time. So that's not very useful. So we'll just change it up here. And you know what? I apologize. I need to make one more modification to my code. What we really need is this. If dark mode is true, we need to add the dark CSS class. If it's false, we don't add anything. And so we can see here that even though we're setting the text here, it doesn't seem to be trickling down. If we set dark text shadow white, let's see if this works here. In fact, let's just do text white to keep it simple. So we can see that the rules of CSS specificity apply because there's a text color setting here. I need one set here. So I do need to, you know, make some modifications. Like over here, we probably need to set a dark mode to wherever we set a text color. So probably right here on the H4. Let's just say dark text white. And so now we have a pretty nice dark mode. Do folks have any questions before we take a break? All right, let's go ahead and take 5. I know that I've ran kind of long with Tailwind, but hopefully it's been useful to dig into it like this. So we'll just take a short 5-minute break, and then when we come back, we'll see how to install Bootstrap. And we'll also see a very brief overview of the components. I'm not going to go into nearly as much depth. Also, a lot of the concepts we hit here are also in Bootstrap. Bootstrap also has a grid and uses breakpoints the same way. So we're really just going to see how to install Bootstrap. I'll show you guys the nav bar and I'll show you guys the grid because those are sort of the key pieces. Sound good? Okay, awesome. Thank you, everyone. And I'll see you all in 5 minutes. All right. So I know we've spent a lot of time on Tailwind. We're not going to spend nearly as much time on Bootstrap, but everything we've covered in Tailwind sort of builds up to this. Right, we covered media breakpoints in Tailwind. We covered pseudo classes. With Bootstrap, we're going to install it, which is a little easier than Tailwind. It's about the same. We're going to see a couple key components. I'm going to show you a button. We're going to see the nav bar, which is a big one. And if we have time, we'll get to the Bootstrap card component where we'll grab some Pokemon data. But I also want to show the grid because the grid is very useful. So let me just go ahead and dive on in and let's start installing Bootstrap. So I've got a brand new React app here that I set up with Vite. It's empty. Our CSS and everything is empty. So we just have a nice fresh install. And Bootstrap is relatively easy to set up. Again, we're going to be using the React Bootstrap library, which is officially supported by Bootstrap and the recommended way to use Bootstrap with React. An installation is relatively simple. As it says here, we need to install these two packages. We need to install React Bootstrap that has all the React components, and the plain old Bootstrap library that has mainly CSS that we need. So we're going to give that just a moment to install. Once that is done, we do need to add a line to our JavaScript code. We need to import the Bootstrap CSS that has all of the CSS rules and styles that Bootstrap will use. We're actually going to do this here in main.jsx. And we're going to import from the Bootstrap library from the dist directory, short for distribution, the minified, which is sort of compressed CSS. And let me just make sure I don't have any typos there. And we want to import this first before our index CSS, I believe. We have to be a little careful because if we put stuff in index.css, it will override this. So we may want to put this here, but in general, we won't be overriding stuff. But that should really be the only thing we need to do. And now we can kind of go to town and get started using Bootstrap and Bootstrap components. So let me go ahead and set up our sort of three window scheme here. Oh, excuse me. And let's start using Bootstrap. So I'm just going to dive right in. It has a lot of different components, and we saw a bit of a preview of this before. Let's get started with just the plain old Bootstrap button. And Bootstrap is heavyweight. As you can see here, there's one button component, but if you look at this example with primary, secondary, success, warning, danger, all you have to do is change the value of this variant prop to get buttons with different colors. And Bootstrap has a way to do dark mode as well, and these colors will change appropriately as well. There's in fact a way to customize the Bootstrap color theme, but that takes a bit more work. As you can see, if I want the buttons to just be an outline form, I can in fact, again, change the variant. So the recommended way to start with Bootstrap is honestly just to copy paste from these examples because there's so much. So I'm just going to go ahead and not here in the CSS file, but here in our app.jsx, I'm going to import that button. I'm going to use it and just test out that it exists. And it would help if my dev server was running. Let's see, failed to resolve import bootstrap dist bootstrap.min.css says the file exists. So this almost definitely means I just have a typo. So let's just go back to our installation step. Or actually, let me copy this from my guide code. I have a missing directory name. I think it needs to be like that. My apologies. So what we need is in the bootstrap dist CSS directory. This link is also in the curriculum for today's lesson in our curriculum repo. So it's there and it's easy to grab. So the nice thing about these components is they have all the same properties you would expect from an HTML element. It has a handle click, for instance. So if I click on my button, I get a click. And so every single attribute that the HTML button element has, you can set as a prop the same way. And if we play around a little bit with the variants, like maybe let's have it be, info. And it would help if I had my single quotes here. We can see that the button changes, and outline info variant, the button changes as well. So again, Bootstrap is more heavyweight, but extremely powerful. And I just want to check in and see if folks have any questions around sort of this button component or really Bootstrap in general. Okay, let's take a look at the nav bar because this one is a beast. So the Bootstrap nav bar is super powerful. It is responsive. You can put buttons in it. You can do all sorts of things. We are going to copy and paste this code. But before we do, let's walk through it because this is actually, in a lot of ways, the easiest way to look at this. So let's start by looking at the imports. We actually need to import a number of different Bootstrap components to use the navbar. That's also why when you actually use this, you should just copy and paste this example here. But we need to understand it because we're going to need to modify it. We're importing a container, which we'll talk about in a minute with layout, the nav bar, and then the nav dropdown. And we see here that there's a nav bar component that encloses everything else. And then it uses a container layout component, which is how it gets the responsiveness for meteor breakpoints and stuff. And then we see here all these really specialized navbar components. And this is where we get to mix and match. Here inside the container, we can kind of get rid of stuff. If I scroll up a bit, what we see here is this nav bar brand is React Bootstrap, and it gives it special stylings. Note that it has an href link that you can add to take it home. These ARIA control properties are for accessibility for screen readers and things like that. And you can just copy and paste this in. These IDs, you should leave. I'm actually not 100% sure if they're necessary, but I think they're good to leave there. And you can see here we have this home button and this link button. And if you look right here and here, we see that these are separate nav.link components. And they're all hidden inside this navbar claps. And then in fact, they have a navbar dropdown component. And inside that, they have a number of items and a divider. So you don't need all this stuff, but in their demo, they're showing you all the nifty things you can do. Right? And because of that nav claps component right here, everything inside it, when we hit a certain breakpoint, collapses into a hamburger button. Right? So this is a great example of the difference between Tailwind and Bootstrap. Tailwind makes it so much easier to build this. Bootstrap builds it for you. It does mean more work in some ways to use Bootstrap, and you are a little more locked in, but then you can build so much so fast. So let me kind of comment out that button example, and we are just going to literally, so we have to be a little careful copying and pasting. I recommend copying and pasting in parts. because otherwise it's easy to make a copy and paste mistake. So first, I'm going to import all the things it says that I need. I'm going to make sure I don't have any errors, that I didn't copy and paste anything wrong from that import statement. Now, this is all inside one return statement, but that won't work for us. So I'm going to grab everything inside the navbar right here, right? And I'm going to paste that in. And I am going to give us some more screen real estate to look at this. And I am going to go ahead and save this. And I'm not sure how I let that sneak in, so we will just get rid of it. And so now we have our own React Bootstrap responsive navbar. And I can change this stuff to be whatever I want, you know. And so in here we see some other link. And then if I had places to go with these hrefs, we could put them in here. Maybe we want this one to go to Google for some reason. Now, as I said, you don't need all this stuff. For instance, if we wanted to get rid of this whole dropdown, we could just get rid of it. And now it's not there anymore. If I get rid, let's put it back. If I get rid of the claps, note how none of this stuff collapses anymore, which is actually not that great because the navbar is kind of designed to collapse stuff. Note how the hamburger menu shows up. So you probably want to put stuff inside a collapse because I think maybe there's a way to disable the hamburger menu, but it's a nice feature to have. So this is the Bootstrap navbar, and it's got a lot of moving parts. But hopefully you can see that a lot of this is boilerplate. I don't even think we need this ID, but you might as well leave it. And honestly, every time I need a Bootstrap navbar, I usually just copy and paste this boilerplate code and like get rid of everything, except really the container and the claps and probably the brand. And I bet this toggle is in fact the hamburger bar. And indeed, once we make that toggle component go away, there is no hamburger. So you can kind of see how these like things interact in more complex ways where you really have to know how they're meant to work together. So I just want to check in and see what questions folks have about the navbar or Bootstrap thus far. How are we feeling about Bootstrap? Pretty good? Cool. All right, let's take a look at layout and then we'll call it a day, I think. So just like with Tailwind, and Bootstrap is like the original CSS framework, and they've had tons of amazing designers. And again, this has been officially supported by Twitter for ages, and used by them. So Bootstrap has some built-in breakpoints. I believe these are actually set to pixels, which is not necessarily a bad thing, especially for sort of maximum compatibility because you can't always depend on rem and m being set correctly. I would have to dig into the CSS though. They could also be looking at rem, but I'm not sure. You can customize breakpoints, but you probably don't want to. There is a way to set a theme and create a theme, but again, that's a bit more complex. The Bootstrap grid is pretty amazing, and it's built with Flexbox. Note, by the way, that the official Bootstrap docs reference this amazing CSS tricks Flexbox article, which really literally is the one that like everyone in the industry reads to learn or refresh themselves on Flexbox. So containers let us center and horizontally pad content. So you can see here there's a container element or a container component, and then we need to have a row component, and then inside of that, a column component. And let's actually hop over to our VS Code. We have container already imported. Let's import the rest. And let's add some container here and see what happens. So obviously this is column 1, 2, 3, and 4, but you can see the responsive Flexbox in action. We don't have to set anything. Bootstrap will figure out the sizing automatically. And note how if we hit the right breakpoint, I might need to make this even smaller. If we hit the right breakpoint, there we go. We have to get really small. But you can see that that row collapses into a column, right? The flex direction changes from row to column. And Bootstrap just does that for us automatically. If I look at the container, I can see that there's a lot of margin and padding that's been added. And I might be getting the property name wrong here. Fluid, that's what I wanted. If I set, so what I'm doing here is fluid equals true, but React.js actually has a shortcut where if you're just adding a Boolean true prop, you can do it like this. So that's what we're seeing here. And now that margin and padding, there's a tiny bit of margin, but that might be coming from the body, in fact. Though I guess not. But there's way less of it now, and so it takes the whole length. You can have inside a row, you can have more rows. I think we probably would want to do it like this. And let me just get rid of this stuff. So here, this isn't so interesting because they're all vertical, but maybe over here, maybe I want to do it differently. Maybe I want a column. So you can have columns inside columns and rows inside rows. And all of this will be fluid and responsive. And then just like with Tailwind, Bootstrap has ways for you to set your sizings. And if we go to the breakpoints, we can see small, medium, large. Let's see if they have an example here. They should. Here we go. you can see you can handle multiple rows. Here we go. And you can set column width and you can do it by breakpoint. So you can make a column wider or smaller depending on the breakpoint. And you can also, I think it uses this auto setting by default for varying width content. This is pretty often what you see is a mixture of different sizes based on breakpoints. And this is what I want to demo. And then we'll wrap up. So I might say here for extra small, each of these is going to have length of 2, and the bootstrap grid goes to 12. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it's a little awkward. So we'll make one more to make it 6. Let's make this a little interesting. On medium, let's have this be 4. And let's have this one be 4. And we'll leave all the others in sort of defaults. And so we can see here, we go big. Those first 2 columns take up way more space because I've set their size for medium and larger to be 4 out of 12 columns. Again, the bootstrap grid is, I believe, a grid of 12, sort of for historical reasons. So let's see if I can do this. There might be, I don't know enough about design to know if 12 is sort of a magic number, but this is the grid of columns and rows right here of 12, where we have, this is my terrible drawing of a row, but 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And so here, what we have going on is these 2 columns both take up 4. And then the other 4 really have been scrunched. But then what will happen is as we get smaller and we hit that medium breakpoint to go from medium to small, they take up less space, right? And we saw here, in fact, they take up 2 now. And since there's 6 columns in total, everything is equal. So again, Bootstrap, more heavyweight, but extremely powerful, right? It's a little bit of personal preference between this and Tailwind. But both are good and both have their use cases. Sorry, just one moment, folks. And I just want to pause and see if folks have any questions about the Bootstrap grid or Bootstrap thus far. How are we feeling about Bootstrap? Cool. Yeah, I think like once you get the concepts down, it's relatively straightforward. So the one component I want to mention that we didn't have time to dig into is the card component, and you will want to spend some time with this one. As you can see here, there's meant to be an image, a title, some description, and then a button. And this is great for, say, displaying a Pokemon. And you can see here, just like the nav bar, there's actually multiple components here. There's a card wrapper component. And then we have, if we want an image on the card, there's a card image component. Note that we only import card, but there's a sort of like name spacing that goes on here. I'd have to look to see how it's implemented, but you guys can kind of see how to use it. And then there's a body, title, text, and so on. And again, the way to do this is you just copy paste and then you modify the boilerplate, which is how pretty much everyone does it to get started. So the assignments for today are going to be, and let me roll in here. So first off, let me give you a little bit of warning. We need to update the Tailwind curriculum content. The installation instructions are still for Tailwind version 3. So these are incorrect. I'll make sure my demos and notes code gets pushed. So just look at my demos and notes code and the Tailwind docs for that. I'll try to update this today, but just don't do this. Instead, follow the steps here and use my demo and notes code as a guide. Sound good? Cool. For Bootstrap, it's good to go. Bootstrap did not have a major version change recently. Otherwise, the Tailwind lecture is good and the Bootstrap stuff is solid. Mike, yes, sir.
This like little project seems pretty open-ended. Are we free to kind of work on maybe like a draft of our personal projects if we have them, like
Yeah.
kind of thought up already?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
If you want to, I think that would be awesome. That said, I think please do try to make sure to like kind of tick all of these boxes. I think like rendering Pokemon is a great thing to practice. As I mentioned, as you know, we love Pokemon and you guys will continue to see Pokemon. But really we want you to combine everything together, right? So make sure you're using use state and use effect and you're making an API call. I am sorry I didn't get to show that bit, but I think we saw a lot of other good bits, especially when it comes to layout. Make sure you use a little bit of Bootstrap and a little bit of Tailwind, especially if you haven't used either before, just to get used to it. Like you'll want to choose one that you use for layout. But then, if you use Tailwind for layout, maybe you use the Bootstrap button or the card component. Using the Bootstrap navbar if you're using Tailwind for layout could be a little trickier, right? If you're using Bootstrap, then just use Tailwind to style something. And if you have a personal project idea that you want to sort of sketch out with this today, I think that'd be awesome. Any questions about today's assignment? All right, good deal, folks. Thank you very much. Much appreciated. Let me go ahead and stop the recording. And I do have to go hop